Hello everyone, and welcome to this new video about a different topic than the usual on this channel. And I would like to talk to you today about the 4 principles of innovation philosophy. So these are 4 big ideas in innovation that I have found through my short career or just my curiosity searching for things online. And the goal here is really to give you exposure to these new ideas so you can become inspired, not to claim that these ideas or principles are the end-all, be-all of innovation. And and yeah, I'm very interested in innovation. I work in research and development already, but I've always been interested in innovation, and I think that I have at least found through all my curiosity and searching for things, I have found very interesting ideas, and I've sort of made kind of a framework, putting them all together in some sort of coherent package, so to speak, that makes sense for me, and I would like to share that to you so you can see what you think of it also. And these 4 principles of innovation are the first principles approach, riding the declining cost curve of a technology, quick iteration, and relative perception and perspective. And you can see on the right there's pictures of people, some of you may recognize. These are the people that either were the first ones that I heard the idea from, or the first ones that made the idea or talked about the idea publicly, or just the ones that made the idea more popular in the internet or in the culture, so to speak. So the first one, first principles approach, was first mentioned, at least for me. I always only first heard about it through Elon Musk, which is the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, which are electric car company and a rocket company, respectively. Then you have Tony Seba, which does a lot of presentations about this topic of technology and the future of technology. Then you have Astro Teller, which works in Google X, which is a part of Google that does also a lot of innovation. And lastly, you have Rory Sutherland, which works in marketing and a company called Ogilvy, I think it's called. Yeah, on its own, I should say that each pillar is already enough to disrupt industries and change the world. So these are powerful concepts. These are not just something that's very simple or easy. Each individual principle already is big and could change a lot how you do your business. But what I was interested in is that when you combine all of these things together, either in your business, or if you're making a product, or if you're having a service, or whatever, then you really have the potential to produce unprecedented explosive change. And I don't think that's ever happened before. People usually tend to just look at one or two of these principles, but to have all of these 4 combined, that's when the magic happens, as they say. So let's start with the first principles approach. And the first principles approach is in contrast to reasoning by analogy, which you have the definition here in an image. And reasoning by analogy is building knowledge and solving problems based on prior assumptions, beliefs, and widely held best practices approved by the majority of people. And we use reasoning by analogy every day. It's an automatic thing. It makes sense for us to use it because by going by what other people are doing, we are in a way conserving resources. Our brain doesn't have to think as hard, for example. But if the problem of that is that doesn't work forever, and if we want to make innovation, if we want to change the world, we can't just go by what has been in the past. We have to think of things from a new way, a new perspective, so we can actually change the world. So in reality, the first principles approach is kind of simple in the concept. So you have to start and identify and define your current assumptions. And I said it's simple in concept because it's hard really to think about your assumptions because they are always going on in the back of your head. They're automatic. Sometimes they're an instinct. It takes a lot of brain effort, so to speak, to detach yourself from what you're always thinking about and kind of look at it from afar and analyze it in a different way. So first you have to do that. Then you break down the problem into its fundamental principles. And here fundamental really means down to the base layer of reality, so to speak. So the physics of it, the chemistry, the biology, the math of it. Really as far down low in this analogy as you can go. And then after you've deconstructed all of that, only then do you start creating the new solutions from scratch. So yeah, easy as 1, 2, 3, but in reality that takes some brain power, some brain cycles. You have to spend some time and effort and mental energy on this. And to give you a more concrete example of how that would work if you're having trouble wrap your head around it as I did, I'm going to quote here an actual example by Elon Musk where he was talking about battery packs because he has this car company that makes battery packs for cars. And people were telling him that, battery packs are really expensive and just as the way they will always be because they're a really complex thing. And they're actually expensive, they said, $600 per kilowatt hour. So it's not really going to be that much better in the future. Maybe we can bring it down to 500. So he started thinking the first principles. And he thought, what are actually batteries made of? Like, what are the materials? And these materials turned out they were carbon, nickel, aluminum, and some polymers. So he then thought, if I went to buy these materials on their own, like in the market, what would actually the price of that be? So it turns out that would only be 80 kilowatt dollars per hour, or $80 per kilowatt hour. So that's actually a big reduction. That's several orders of magnitude less expensive. So the real problem here, according to him, is that you have to find that clever way to take those materials and combine them in a cheap but good way to make that battery cell, because then you can have the batteries that are much cheaper than anyone realizes. So it's this thinking about looking at the materials and then the materials in terms of physics, for example, and then kind of the way the real innovation here is to think about how to combine them. So not just slowly iterate the original design, but kind of deconstruct based on what the materials are needed. And from then you can build a better battery. And you might not realize it, but this has also another implication, which is if you can do this kind of exercise in your business, for example, or your product or your service, and you can get down to that limit of physics or biology or whatever. So if you can really get close to that limit of reality, so to speak, and then you can use that to get ahead of everybody else, that means that whoever tries to compete with you or catch up with you, they have to bear such a high startup cost just to get to your point that they will not be able to do it, or they will have to really have a huge investment. And there's implications of this in terms of maybe this will produce monopolies or whatever, but if you are trying to innovate in your business, you really have to think of this in some way to really go down to the bare minimum of reality, so to speak, and then deconstruct and think about things from the ground up. Okay, so we've dealt with that now, first principles approach. Let's go to the next principle, which is riding the declining cost curve. So Tony Seba does a lot of presentations, and one thing he's always talking about is that how in our lifetimes, so in the last century or two, technologies or some technologies have had an exponential declining cost curve. This means that the cost to produce certain technologies has gone down exponentially, which is huge. And that means also we get the benefit of better products at a cheaper price constantly, which improves our quality of life somehow. So when he says that we should be riding this declining cost curve, that means that you should be using these cost reductions that are happening to either create new technologies or to gain a huge advantage over competitors that are stuck with technologies whose prices don't decline so awesomely. You have here 3 examples of such technologies. On the left, you have solar panels and their photovoltaic solar panels and their price declines. Then you have battery packs that we mentioned earlier with the Elon Musk example. And then you have 3 others here, which is data storage, computing, and genome sequencing. So if you can surf this wave, so to speak, if you can ride that cost curve down, and your competitors don't, then you really have a huge advantage. That just compounds. If you're already doing the first principles and then you're also doing this, the gap just grows so much wider in that sense. So yeah, to try to bring this point home a bit more, in your business you should be riding this declining cost curve for your offering somehow at some point. And there's two main reasons. The first one is just it's a great opportunity to create disruption and quickly gain a big market share. But arguably, in my opinion, more importantly, if a competitor does it and you don't, then it's just a matter of time until you're out of the game. And Tony Seba specifically mentioned the example of Kodak versus Apple. So Kodak, if you don't know, was a company that had analog cameras, and that was their only business. But they actually invented or were very early on in developing the digital cameras. But they didn't fully embrace that because their business model was still reliant on the analog cameras with the film that you had to develop. Apple, on the other hand, fully embraced that. And as a result, Kodak was out of that game completely, and Apple survived and thrived because of that. So if you're a business or you're thinking about innovation, the question then becomes, which technologies have this declining cost curve that they apply to you, and how can you apply them to your business or your product or your services that you're developing? And we'll talk a bit more about this later on with an example. The third principle now, it's the quick iteration. So Astro Teller, he has been in Google X, which is a department of Google that does a lot of out-of-the-box innovation, we could say. And he had some presentations where he talked about some of the ideas behind that department to try to get even more innovation than usual. And if I could summarize that philosophy of his department, or that he talked about, it would be that you should think about how you will kill your idea today. And this is in stark contrast with what most of us do, which is when we have a new idea, we kind of try to protect it in a way. We don't want to destroy it because we attach, in a way, our identity to the idea. But he says that no, you should kind of think about the other way around. We should try to kill your idea as fast as possible, because if it will die, that means it was not a good idea in the first place. But if it survives, on the other hand, then you have a really good idea and you can go with it. So breaking down some of the concepts that he talks about that you should have enthusiastic skepticism plus unbridled or unrestrained optimism. So this means really balancing that difficult juggle, so to speak, between that you have the idea and you're really excited and you want to develop it, and at the same time, you have to be a bit skeptical that, yeah, sure, it might not work. On the other hand, to have that optimism, that real optimism that, yeah, this will work and we'll find a way to make it work no matter what. So those two things you kind of need to combine in some way. And if you worked already in R&D or innovation in general, you might have heard this saying, which is that you have to find the 10,000 ways that something doesn't work before you find the one way it does work. So this was said by Thomas Edison, and really the point here is that you have to be ready to fail. You have to, in a way, embrace the failure. You must not be afraid to see your idea die. Sometimes a horrible death, because you have put so much effort and energy into it and it just dies. You just have to keep going, keep the grind, keep struggling forward, and eventually you'll get there. And part of getting there means finding that Achilles heel early on, not later down the road. Because if you find a problem that maybe not so apparent if you're just developing the idea and you're not paying attention, but later down the road it becomes a massive issue. If you find that early on, that will save you so much time and resources and money that it's just worth the extra mental effort in the beginning rather than the sunken cost later. And the way to kind of do that is that you have to shift perspectives. So sometimes, and this has happened to me, when I'm thinking about an idea or I'm doing some innovation work, I tend to it's okay, so I get an idea and I get really excited and I start to think about all the good things about it. So I start geeking out in a way and thinking about all the implications. But at this point, you really should be shifting perspectives so that you can see the idea from all angles, and thus you can kill it in a way. You can find that problem that will bite you in the ass, so to speak, early on. So yes, part of doing that is to test that thing that might kill the project first. You have to test that first. So, for example, in my line of work, sometimes we always start with an idea at a small scale. And something we have learned throughout the years is that when you are in that small scale, you already have to think about how you need to build it at the large scale when you want to implement it in a really big scale in many different places. Because if you just get stuck geeking out and thinking about all the good things your idea has when you're early on and it's small, that's easy to do, all right, but then there might be some crucial thing you're missing that you didn't see by shifting those perspectives. And then when you try to scale it up, you can't do it. And then you have all that sunken cost and energy and money, and it's horrible. You don't want to do that. So Astro Teller thought, how can we make sure that these interests are aligned so that people actually do all of those things instead of falling to their instinct, so to speak, which is to geek out or to just be too optimistic. So he talks about that you should make it safe to fail in your company or whatever you're doing the innovation work. And in a way, you should also reward failure. So in his specific case, they actually gave bonuses to the Google engineers that proved that an idea wouldn't work. And their reasoning was that those engineers that proved it didn't work, they actually saved the company a lot of time and resources by identifying that crucial thing in the idea that wouldn't make it work. And for that, they should be compensated because that creates the incentive that people are always thinking about how to kill the idea. Okay, so that's the quick iteration principles. And now we go to the last one by Rory Sutherland. And this one arguably is the least similar to the previous ones. It's not so apparent, perhaps. And I would summarize his ideas as seeing things from a different, more lateral point of view. So the first one is that our perception is leaky. And he talks about different examples, such as we feel our car drives better after a car wash, or branded painkillers that are literally more effective because we perceive them to be. If French music is played while you're wine shopping, you're likelier to buy French wine. This is a concept called priming. And not many people actually recognize that music influence, but it actually did influence them. So that's one of the interesting things, that we humans are very flawed in a way, and we were shaped by nature to be that way for a reason, but that also means there's opportunities for people doing innovation because of that. Another concept is that people like specialists more, and he gives the example of Google, that Google won by focusing on just being a very good search engine. After that, of course, it's since expanded into everything. But the argument here is that people like specialists more because they think that if they are a specialist, they're just focused on that one thing and they've made it really well, rather than if they're a generalist or they're branded as a generalist, then that means that they may be too spread out across too many different fields, that whole thing of jack of all trades, master of none, and thus they may not give the proper attention to the service or product that maybe they do, or that they should do. Then he also has this concept about how real value versus dubious value model of reality is false. And the example here is that they were trying to improve the Eurostar train. I think it's in London, or between London and France, or the UK and France. And they managed to do that for a fraction of the cost. So engineers were stuck thinking that they should just try to make it faster, because that's what people really want. It's just to get there faster. And they spent £6 billion shortening the travel time from London to Paris by 40 minutes. Whereas Rory Sutherland would argue that instead, you shouldn't make it faster. You should make people enjoy the slower ride more, because that's easier to do, and because we are very subjective creatures, so to speak, we might actually enjoy that more. So he actually suggested that they should install free Wi-Fi in the trains for about 0.01% of the costs, and people would actually subjectively value that train ride more, even if it took extra 40 minutes. Another example here is that imagine a restaurant that serves Michelin-starred food, but the restaurant smells of sewage and there's human feces on the floor. Improving the quality of the food further would have far lesser value than cleaning up the restaurant. So that's kind of an absurd example, but kind of drives the point home a bit more. Then he talks about how you should change the frame of reference dramatically to actually change the value, the perceived value of something, which is actually the real value of something. And he has some funny examples to talk about this. So Frederick the Great in Germany, I think, tricked everyone into eating potatoes by rebranding it as exclusive to the royals. So he noticed that people were starving. He knew about this new crop called potato. He tried to plant them, but people were very not maybe afraid or skeptical of it. And to be able to convince people to do it, he thought a bit outside the box, or changed the frame of reference by telling his guards to guard the potatoes and saying that it's actually a very important crop and the poor people cannot actually eat it because it's that much good. And that kind of made people think, oh, maybe this is actually good, we should go. And they would break into the gardens and steal the potatoes to plant themselves. Of course, the guards had been instructed not to interfere. That kind of rebranding or changing the reference is funny. Another example, I think this is in Turkey, was that Ataturk had effectively, they had trouble banning the wearing of veils. And to convince people, he actually banned, he mandated that only prostitutes should wear the veils. So that created this whole social stigma that made normal people not want to wear the veil, because otherwise they would be associated as a prostitute. And another final example is that you can get status through significance. So, for example, cast iron jewelry became more valuable in Prussia than gold or silver because of wartime significance. During the war, people contributed jewelry to fund wartime efforts, and they were compensated with iron replicas. And this made sure that iron was more valuable for people than just gold or silver. Okay, and this last one from Rory Sutherland is that you should look for small changes that can solve huge problems. So, for example, in Scotland, they had something called speeding smileys. So, in speed signs, they had a smiley or sad face, and they found out that this was twice as effective as just having the normal speed camera with the numbers. And he also says that people don't visit online banking sites more because seeing your bank balance is depressing in a way. His suggestion was just to make it optional. And in the Lidmar Hotel in Stockholm, they made their customers' hotel stay enjoyable by letting them choose their own elevator music. So in the elevator, there were several buttons with different music, so people were more engaged in that experience that's typically boring of just being in the elevator. And in Korean traffic lights, they actually had a timer. And they found out that people actually tolerated longer waiting times if they know how long they're waiting for. So in the end, the conclusion here is that perspective is everything. And his killer insight is that you don't always need to solve difficult technical challenges with big, expensive technical solutions. Sometimes you just need to see things from a different or more lateral point of view. So now I will try to really drive this point home so you can think about it with a concrete example. And I chose food because I work a lot with the growing food. And this is just an example to kickstart the thought process so that you can apply the principles to any topic you want. I'm not going to go through this example all the way through. This is just I will just show you how I would start thinking about it. So then you can also think how you would start thinking about things that you care about or the innovation that you want to do. And okay, so I started thinking about first principles. We must grow food because we are alive, and as we live, we need to use resources and energy, and they must be replenished, otherwise, we die. Okay, that's all very simple and very basic. What is this food? Okay, we need water, proteins, vitamins, fat, carbohydrates, minerals, etc. These are the main things we humans need to eat. So then I go a bit further. What are proteins? You can see here what are they made of, what are vitamins, what is fat, what are carbohydrates, what are minerals. So kind of breaking down that initial problem or question into the real fundamental things that we really cannot change. You cannot change how vitamins are made of or that you need them, at least yet. But these are so kind of going down that to that base layer of reality, so to speak. And then I ask myself, why do we need the food specifically? So it provides energy to act in the environment or to do work. It maintains life and repairs structure and stimulates growth. Okay, so that's all done, all well and good, and but it's not enough to just do this. So we need to start thinking also what actually we cannot change. So what is outside our individual or corporate control if you're thinking in your company? So in this case, we cannot stop being hungry. We have no conscious control over food once it enters the body. We have an automatic raw reaction to its visual properties and odor, either good or bad. We have very little control of when we want to eat. That is, we feel that we want to eat. Whether we eat or not is another question. We have a bit more control of that. But even then, we don't have that much control. There's also an existing infrastructure in society to produce and transport food. That means there's sunken cost and time and effort and energy and money. Again, I mentioned that. And also, there's a lot of tools and knowledge that already exist that can be useful. And we cannot change or reach that theoretical maximum efficiency of biological processes in food production, for example. Or if I'm talking about biological processes, I could easily talk about physics or chemistry. Even though there is that theoretical maximum efficiency of reactions or whatever, it's very hard for us to actually reach that. And finally, this is more important if you're in a company, you have limited resources like monetary, manpower, and time-wise to research and develop new food production processes. And then that's when you really start to deconstruct this idea of food production, and you try to think really outside the box or laterally or whatever you want to call it. So as of now, most food comes from intensive monocrop soil agriculture, animal farming, and mining, in the sense that you get nutrients or minerals to fertilize, for example, the soil or whatever. But this is not the only way to do things, of course. First of all, there may be better monocrops that have not been discovered yet. This could be through selective breeding or through genetic engineering even. Some food may not need to come from animals or plants. Here I mean that you could have, for example, mineral food as a liquid instead of having, or you could eat, for example, insects. I'm not counting insects as animals here. Or you could have something that you don't ordinarily consider a plant, for example, like algae or microalgae. There is a lot of food waste produced for food coming from higher organisms. Here, this is a bit of a basic concept if you really think about it, because if you raise a cow, for example, to eat, the part of the cow that you really eat is very is very little compared to the whole of the cow. And even if you think about a plant, for example, if you're growing a tomato plant, it's only really the tomato fruit that you eat. All the rest of the plant was just there to grow that tomato. But maybe there is a way that you could find to just grow a smaller plant with just as big a tomato. I don't know. This is what you have to think about, that kind of outside the box thing. Food and nourishment may not be in a solid form. Again, this could be like a liquid, or who knows, even a gas. I mean, there's different ways that you can approach that. And even if you're thinking about microbial food already, there's different types of things you can do. There's the bacteria, there's the eukaryotes, and there's the archaea. Those different groups. Perhaps you only use or focus on one of them, but there's that whole other kingdom to discover, so to speak. And we still have relatively little control of how food grows and when, for now, which means that maybe there is that potential there to accelerate the time that it takes for a plant to grow by, I don't know, engineering the plant to grow something first rather than what it does now. Even if you use microorganisms to do something, the microorganisms, the thing, for example, if you're using them to produce a certain compound that will become the food you eat, it's not the microorganism itself that's doing that work, it's the enzymes that are inside of them. What they're doing is they're protecting the enzymes through the cell wall, so to speak. So if you can get that enzyme and do the same thing just with the enzyme, you're saving that extra cost of having to feed the microorganism with food or light or whatever. Another simple concept is that food can be grown before it reaches the supermarket. Here, this could just mean, creating a product or service for people to grow at home or closer to home, so you don't have that transportation cost to get the food to the supermarket. Or it could even be in the future, for example, that you make your own food at home, maybe not just a plant, but even meat. So you could have like a printer that prints the meat. You have to really be creative here, but I think you know what I mean. And also, food could be made locally from food waste. So, for example, now it comes from mining and something called the Haber-Bosch principle, where you extract the nitrogen from the air and you turn that into fertilizer. But maybe there is a cheaper and safer, or not, maybe not safer, but cheaper and just a safe way to get that food using food waste that we are already producing. So kind of closing that circle of that, or that cycle. And lastly, maybe the food can be made with some sort of direct energy to convert the compounds, rather than using indirect energy from biology or aeration. I'm talking here, for example, if you have microbiology, and if you have a reactor, for example, and you're using that biology there with the bacteria or whatever, and you have also the oxygen mixing everything, perhaps you can skip that and just, I don't know, add electricity to that reactor with just the water without the bacteria, and that energy will transform the compounds into something useful. I don't know. But here are just some ways you could think about more specifically about this topic of food in particular. Then we go into the second principle, which is writing that declining cost curve. So if you remember in the previous, in another slide, I spoke which technologies have a declining cost curve and how can they be applied to your business or our business as the main question that you should be asking. And if you look at in food, a couple of things that have been declining a lot this century have been the production of and storage of energy, the computing power, creation and storage of data, molecular and genetic sequencing and tracing, precision fermentation, and artificial intelligence. And all of those things could in some way or form affect how food can be made in a cheaper way, or continue to become cheaper over time. So here I try to reframe the concept of food producers to get you to think a bit more outside of that box that we're always in. So here I'm going to claim, might not be true, but I'm going to claim to get you to think about this, that food producers knowingly or unknowingly can become a data company, which sounds very weird, but stick around and I'll explain it. So first of all, they can gather new data from literature reviews or old data from the experience of former workers like farmers or cattle producers or something. As a data company, they can create the data through, I don't know, leaf samples, parameter measuring, sensors, technique comparisons, genetic pool, if you're talking about animals, for example, or microbial things or plants even, etc. That data can drive their development and design choices. They can sell their expertise, which is based on the data they've accumulated through decades. They can sell services to generate new data for others. This could be courses, for example. And of course, they sell the product of their data, which is food. However, they, in this case, that hypothetical data company, which is actually a food producer, are limited in their capacity to generate and process data today. So if you're, for example, a farmer, most methods you have for that data generation are expensive in resources and time. There is noise in the data. The tools to create the data are still mostly analog. And this is applying both for companies and people. Our processing of data is constrained by the limits of the human brain. So the speed of it, the quantity, the lateral thinking, the meta-thinking, and the environment from which the brain grew. So for example, we are not robots, and we cannot and we don't want to commit 100% of brain cycles to work. So we want to enjoy life also. We just don't want to think constantly about innovation or data generation. So these food producers, they should in some way transition to better data creation and processing technologies, which are always becoming cheaper. And these include sensors, which you can think about as senses in a way, supercomputers, which you can think about as the brain, and then the artificial intelligence software, which you can think about as the mind. Because if a competitor can produce more data faster and of better quality, they will be able to get ahead of you or of this hypothetical food producer data company, while you're stuck with older technology and its sunk cost. And at some point, the competitor becomes so far ahead that you have to catch up anyway, and then you have to invest the time and the money to transition, while the competitors are far away. But also to mention that the point is not just to replace employees with data and its processing, but to increase their effectiveness and to create even more time for a better work-life balance. We don't want to become slaves to technology or to data creation or whatever. We want to actually work less and be more effective at the work that we actually do. And as a more specific example here, I say that precision fermentation and molecular gene sequencing, for example, they will not only require data, but they will also produce vast amounts of data for refinement and iteration. So these are two technologies that are becoming big for food production. And because they are producing these vast amounts of data, they will reinforce a feedback loop in price declines for meat and plant alternatives, because that food that now we get from meat or from plant will actually come from microbiology. So that's a more specific idea or example that you can think about how this riding the declining cost curve might affect food production in the short term. And you might actually start seeing already that there's a lot of what they call fake meat burgers, for example, or fake meat in general, that actually comes either from plants or from microbiology, that is becoming cheaper and will continue to become cheaper than traditional meat from cows or from pigs or from chickens. Okay, now we go to the third principle in action, the quick iteration principle. I've divided these in, sorry about the numbering on the left, this should be 1, 2, 3, but I've divided it into 3 parts: the idea generation part, the idea testing, and the idea evaluation. So in the idea generation, you could promote this quick iteration by having dedicated and regular wild brainstorming sessions. And wild here means that there's very little constraints. You're not worried about evaluating the idea while you're throwing them out there. You just have a group of people together. You're just throwing the ideas out there as much as you can. Someone is writing them down. You don't spend time thinking about are they actually good or not. Just whatever you think about goes written somewhere, and later on you will evaluate it. And could be important also to do that brainstorming with different parts of the company, even if they're non-technical, because people have different experiences. And if you have worked with innovation, sometimes you know that the best ideas come from unexpected places, because people have a different point of view, or they see things that you cannot see because you're used to seeing them in a certain way. So that could be an enabler and an interesting part that you can add to your brainstorming, is to add people that are not always working with what you're working with. And of course, you must change perspectives between 2 important things. What do you want, even if it's impossible? So think about the utopia. Think about, I don't know, the absolute most dreamlike thing you or your company could want, and write it down, and don't worry about if it's impossible. But that's like the goal. That's the end of the road, so to speak. And then you should also think about what is possible. So what are things that you could do today, even if you don't want them? Write that down. So then you have where you are already, or what has been in the past, and where you want to go. And then you can focus on finding all those intermediary steps in between to do that, to create that spectrum between what maybe you don't want and what you really want, but it's impossible. And maybe after you've written down all the possible combinations, you can actually find that which you want and is possible. So you do that, you have your idea generations, you have a lot of crazy ideas. Now you need to test. That's the important part now, is that testing and iteration and improving on your testing and not being afraid to kill your idea. So first of all, obviously, you should prioritize the testing of ideas with the biggest potential impact. Because if you start with the small ideas, you're spending all that time there, and the impact may not be so big. But if you start with the big ideas, even if most of them fail, the one that will not, because it's a big idea, will create a lot of impact. And yes, trying to prove it doesn't work first, as I've said before. But here I added carefully, because we are humans and we have biases, and some of them are negative biases. So if you're just trying to throw everything you have in an idea, and it's starting to look like it might not work, you might start thinking, okay, just forget it and we'll move on to something else. But you have to be thorough. It's easy to fall into the trap of just being too negative, because we don't want to feel hurt in a way that we spend that time in energy in the idea and now it doesn't work. Don't be afraid of being hurt. It happens all the time. There'll be more ideas. Don't worry about it. But make sure that you don't neglect or dismiss an idea too quickly also. And start with the most likely thing to go wrong, and then the next most likely, etc. So in a way, start basic. And the most likely thing to go wrong should also be things that are very important later on or now. So for example, I don't know, if you're building a chair, what's the most likely thing to go wrong? It's that the chair is not going to be able to stand up in the first place. Okay, what's the next most likely thing? Maybe it's not going to last that long, even if it stands on. So kind of thinking in that way. And if you're in a company, for example, you could promote that failure mentality, so to speak, by having failure snacks or failure parties. So if someone actually proves that the idea doesn't work, for example, in Google, they were giving the bonuses, but I'm not going that far. I'm just saying you have a coworker or an employee that is doing your innovation, and they actually proven that the idea didn't work. Don't just say, okay, well, you tried and we'll do something else. Actually reward them. Have like a snack, a party. You can also bring together other people from the company. Talk about the experience. Maybe you get a new idea from that. Who knows? I mean, as you know, in innovation, ideas come from the most unusual places. And failure snacks could just be that place. We just don't know. Okay, lastly, idea evaluation. If the idea survived the worst you threw at it, now you have to discuss it with others and begin that formal process of bringing that idea to life and actually selling it as a product or a service. And here I would just say that you can do the normal innovation procedure. So you test at the small scale, then you go to like a mid-size scale, and then the big scale, the demonstration scale. So you can bring clients, for example, or you can just start selling it as a market. So these are the quick iteration parts. And now we will move to the last part of the inaction, the relative perception and perspective. I'm sorry if there's a lot of text. I'm going to try to make it, I hope it's informative at least. But it is a lot of stuff to cover. So we've done now this example about the food, and we've gone through a lot of different steps. But as a company, even after you've created this new product or service at an unbeatable price that keeps getting cheaper because of that technology curve going down, and you've tested it and it kind of proves that it works, even if it survived everything you threw at it, you still need to convince the buyers or the customers or the consumers. And the key insight from Rory Sutherland here also is that there's two fundamental ways to make a value in the business. Either you find out what people want and ingeniously find a way to make it, or more specifically in our case, we find out what you can make with the first principles, with the riding the technology curve, the quick iteration, and then you find an ingenious way of making people want it. So to some extent, he argues that innovation and marketing are the same thing. How many technological problems are really marketing problems in disguise? How many new food markets, for example, came from a perceived problem? For example, immune boosters. It's a market where people buy pills or vitamins to boost their immune system. And we don't really need that. Our immune system is fine. But that market still came because there was a perceived problem rather than an actual need. And it helps to change people's frame of reference in this case to help create value. And that's that royal potato example in Germany I spoke about. And the same concept you can do with adding a dummy option to emphasize the previous two. And you can notice this in, for example, fast food menus. They'll have the small option and they'll have the big option, but people sometimes they want that middle part. They think that middle part is what has the best value. So if you just introduce that, people will just buy that more, for example. And binary options, on the other hand, can be sometimes better at producing results and ensuring that choices are made rather than having a spectrum of choices. So if in the opposite way, for example, in a food menu, you have too many choices, like 5 or 6, maybe just having 2 or 3 could be better. And the example here is that if you have a red light traffic, people tend to obey that more than a speed limit, which is more of a spectrum. And yeah, we can use confirmation bias also to our advantage. I have a funny comic here. But the idea here is that you focus on making great first experiences, and then people naturally will rationalize that when they see a new product as a confirmation bias. So something that works very well with consumers, he says, Rory Sutherland, is that if you add things without an immediate return of investment, that warms customers' hearts and signals that you have made an investment and you actually care. So people appreciate that. And that means, I don't remember exactly the example he gave, but it was something like, if you buy a car, which is a big cost, and then you have all these little Easter eggs that the company puts in there, that people like that a lot because it signals to people that you're not just interested in making the car and selling it and then you wash your hands and you're done with it. No, you care about that people have good experiences. You care about having all of this joint experience of the customers with the company, because it's kind of painting like a story together, so to speak. And this also works in a way when you think about it, customers actually prefer products that are heavily advertised. And the reason behind this is that it's less likely to be crap, according to them, that products they've never heard of. This is called the game theory hypothesis by consumers. So they're kind of, an individual consumer is relying on all the other consumers having made that choice before to ensure that they're not going to make that bad of a choice when they choose it. So for example, if you have 2 phones, one of them you see advertisements everywhere and you hear about people using it, and the other one you don't hear so much, it's very obscure. Just on pure probability, it's more likely that the one that people talk about and that people use is less likely to be crap because it's already been vetted, so to speak, or it's been judged by so many people and they still use it. That means you're probably going to like it also. So this is a way that we already automatically offload some of the decision making to our peers. And we do this constantly, automatically and instinctively. It's just the way we are. And as a last concept, if we take the single variable that best differentiates your target audience from everyone else and then focus on that gives you an advantage. So if you have a product or service you want to sell and you want to think about who your actual customer is going to be, you should try to categorize them. Why is that customer that more likely to buy our product than someone else? What is the characteristics? Maybe it's because they are actually very scientific literate. Okay, so maybe we can take that concept and really push that into the product or service, so that compounds the potential interest that those target audience might have in wanting your product, because they know, okay, you also share the same interests, so to speak. Okay, so this has been a long presentation, and I hope that you have managed to I don't know, become inspired, think about innovation, what you can do for your company or for yourself if you're thinking about making a product or a service. Yeah, this was a lot of content, I realize, and some concepts are not so easy to first understand. So make sure you go back and rewatch specific parts. If you have some questions, put them in the comments and I'll try to answer them. And I also have here links that I will put in the description of some of the first presentations that I saw related to each one of those principles. So if you are having trouble understanding because of me, or because I was not able to express myself well, maybe hearing it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, might actually help you out. But yeah, I hope you enjoy this. I hope you're able to innovate. The world needs more innovation for sure. If you have a success story that you have used any of these principles before, you already knew of some of them and you used them and you had success, please share it with us in the comments so other people can become inspired and try it out. And lastly, share this with someone if you think they could benefit. Again, I'm not saying this is the philosophy of innovation, or this is the only way to do innovation. I'm saying this is a new way to think about innovation, and perhaps some companies or some people might benefit from thinking about this because they hadn't heard of it. These are powerful ideas. These are not my ideas, but they are powerful ideas, and that's why I'm making the video, so I can share them with you, because they are ideas worth sharing. So again, thank you for your time, and I hope to see you in the next video.